Hi there, WRT Melton learners. We really hope that you're all managing to stay healthy right now, and equally important to stay balanced during this very stressful time. Please know that everyone here at WRT, the clergy, the professional staff, are here to support you in whatever way that we can. If you or a loved one is not feeling well or is in need of any kind of support, please don't hesitate to reach out to us so that we can know what's going on in our community and do our best to help provide during these uncertain times. I'm really glad that we're able to convene on this video platform. Several people have asked if we'll be able to do an interactive convening, and our plan is indeed to do so. It's just taken us a little while to get our Zoom account ready to go and to all feel equipped and prepared to use it well. So for this first week at least, we're going to offer the Melton curriculum via video. And we hope that you'll follow along at home. You'll see that the email that I sent you contained attachments to a class outline, exactly as we would do in our in-person sessions. And of course, you should follow along in your Melton readers as we go through the material for today's learning. You'll see that I'm coming to you right now from inside my kids' bedroom. This is their rocking chair and their little table over there. So I hope that you're also somewhere that's cozy and feels loving, and somewhere where you're able to hunker down, but still nourish yourself in these unusual times. So with that as a little bit of stage setting, why don't we dive right in? I'll lead us in our blessing for sacred study. So the words are on your handouts. Please feel free to join in with me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, our eternal God, sovereign of the universe, who makes our lives holy with sacred responsibilities and commands us to engage in words of Torah. So this first video lesson is on the purposes curriculum, and we're in lesson number 20 in that curriculum. The name of the lesson is Divine Providence, or in Hebrew, Hashgachah, which is the Hebrew for divine providence. Providence is a word that refers to God's care for what happens here on earth. And we're going to look at a couple of the components of what Jewish faith has said God's providence is all about. And we'll also examine some of the problems that arise with that belief. So you'll see at the top of our handouts, the central idea for today is the following. A central tenet of classical Jewish faith is the notion that God is interested in and involved in the affairs of humankind in general, and also the Jewish people in particular. Now, given that principle, Jewish thinkers throughout the ages have proposed various solutions to the problem of suffering. Fancy word for the problem of suffering in philosophical speak is theodicy. In sort of colloquial language, it means when bad things happen to good people. So if we believe that God is interested in and involved in the affairs of humankind, then the immediate question is, well, why then do bad things happen to good people? And we're going to see a couple of Jewish responses to that question, noting sort of here up front that there really aren't any perfectly satisfactory answers to that question, which is probably why it's one of the thorniest and unsolvable problems of Jewish theology and theology in general. Nevertheless, we're going to tackle a couple of those. So with that as our big idea for the day, let's dive right in to our texts. So the first text that we're going to look at together is in our readers listed as text number 2. It's actually one of the biblical texts, which means that it's not here in the reader itself. It would only be in a Hebrew Bible. So if you happen to have a Hebrew Bible at home, you can pull it out. If you don't have a Hebrew Bible at home, then I've included the text here in our PDF handout. So if you do have a Hebrew Bible, now's a good time to pause the video and find your way to Psalm 33. And if you're following along on the handout, then you've already got what you need right in front of you. I'll read for us this selection from Psalm 33, and we'll make some observations at the end of it. Again, all of these observations I've outlined in fairly detailed form on the handout so that you can reference this, and since we don't have the opportunity to engage in it together. And pardon, that was my phone just buzzing, but we're going to stay focused with you all right now. So here we go, Psalm 33. Starting actually in verse 12, even though the reader says we should start in verse 13, I actually think that verse 12 is important too. So that's why I've included verse 12. Happy is the nation whose God is the eternal, the people God has chosen to be God's own. The eternal looks down from heaven. God sees all humankind. From God's dwelling place, God gazes on all the inhabitants of the earth. God fashions the heart of them all, discerns all their doings. Kings are not delivered by a large force. Warriors are not saved by great strength. Horses are a false hope for deliverance. For all their great power, they provide no escape. Truly, the eye of the eternal is on those who fear God, who wait for God's faithful care, to save them from death, to sustain them in famine. So a couple things to lift up out of this short selection from the book of Psalms. The first is that I've highlighted sort of a key word here. You'll see in verse 14 in the English, I've highlighted the word gazes. In the Hebrew, you'll see that the corresponding word is hashgachah, which is what has been translated here as gazes, but is the word, the root, the Hebrew root, that gives rise to the term Hashgachah, which we've translated in this lesson, or the Melton curriculum authors have translated in this lesson, as Divine Providence. Now, I did a little just modern Hebrew dictionary search for this same root, hashgachah, and the whole field of meaning is the following. And again, we should just note that this is modern Hebrew as opposed to biblical Hebrew, so there's slight differences in terms of fields of meaning, but it nevertheless provides us with a broad-based context. Some synonyms that hashgachah may translate to are listed here on our form, our handout. Hashgachah is to supervise. Actually, the person who's responsible for supervising whether a kitchen is maintaining strict kashrut policy, that person's called a mashgiach, same root. So the person who supervises a kitchen is doing the same thing that evidently God is doing here in this text. So imagine the person who's supervising the kashrut in the kitchen, making sure that everything is going the way that it should be, making sure that anything that's not supposed to happen doesn't happen. The way that the mashgiach, the kitchen supervisor, interacts with the kitchen is the way that God interacts with the world, according to this text at least. So to supervise, that's one possible definition for hashgachah, to watch out for, to protect, to notice, and as the JPS translation of the psalm has given us, to gaze. So that's the first thing to lift up. The second is from the following verse. It says, God fashions the hearts of humankind and discerns all our doings. Taken together, this notion that God gazes, in verse 14, upon all the inhabitants of the earth and fashions our hearts and discerns our doings means what I've listed here on our handout, that God is not an absentee God. God didn't, put all the gears together in the clock, wind it up, and then let it go, and then go off to, watch whatever's on television. Even if God isn't necessarily involved in the world, at the very least, God is interested in what happens in the world. God is watching, gazing, as it were, here. And we might even say fashions the hearts, discerns their doings, might indicate at least some degree of involvement by God, that not only is God not setting it up, winding it up, and then letting it go and walking away, God is definitely interested, and what's more, God might even be actively involved, as we'll see the next couple of verses make the case for. So following along a little bit further into the psalm, verses 16 and 17, it talks about how kings, even if they have large armies, that still wouldn't save them from destruction, and how warriors wouldn't be saved by their strength, and how horses can't deliver us because God has a plan in mind, according to the psalm. Let's take a look. Their great power provides no escape because God has a plan that God's going to enact. So these next couple of verses, 16 and 17, seem to be making the case that God's not only interested, gazing, hashgachah, upon the world, but God's actively involved. No matter how big your army, God will intervene in order to make whatever it is that God wants to happen. And then finally, in this psalm, we should look at the last two verses, 18 and 19, where it says, those who fear God, those who wait for God's faithful care, those people will merit somehow God's protection. So if you want to be a part of God's plan, you can be, according to this psalm. And the way to do so is to fear, or another translation might be to live with awe of God, to fear God, or to live in awe of God, and to wait for God's faithful care. Those would be the ways to become a part of whatever God's plan may be. Now, a question immediately might arise for us. When it says those who fear God, is that a universal statement? Can anyone get in on that? Or is that a particular statement? Is that only reserved for people who follow the Jewish people's particular way of serving God? And the psalm doesn't give like a really clear answer to that question. Verse 12, for example, which I added, even though the Melton curriculum writers didn't include that as one of the pertinent verses, I added it. Verse 12 says, where we started, happy is the nation whose God is the eternal, the people who God has chosen to be God's own. So verse 12 would seem to give some kind of indication that God's protection is intended for those who follow the particular path of the Jewish people. But to complicate that immediate answer, look at the very next verse, verse 13. It says, God looks down from heaven, God sees all humankind, all the inhabitants of the earth on 14. Those seem to be indications that anyone can be a part of God's plan. After all, it does say here in 18 and 19, those who fear God, who wait for God's faithful care. Those are pretty broad, general kinds of requirements for meriting God's protection. If it said something more specifically Jewish, like those who follow God's commandments, like that would be a key word for us, or those who keep the Sabbath, or those who, maintain sacrifices at the temple, then that would be a stronger argument for the narrowness of the scope of who is under God's faithful care. My sense is that the psalm is laying sort of a broad field of people for whom God will act on their behalf to their benefit. So this psalm sort of just gives a nice, succinct, biblical version of the Jewish idea of Hashgachah, of divine providence, the idea that God is involved, or let's start with the more basic thing, that God is interested in what happens here on earth, and that God is even involved in what happens here on earth. And then third, that people can sort of work their way into God's plan and have God be involved even for them. So that's the first piece of our lesson today. I should just add that, the Melton curriculum writers picked this psalm because it kind of encapsulates a couple of key ideas, those three that I just laid out. But we didn't really need this psalm to kind of give us this point. We had a lesson much earlier on in the year that talked about the Exodus from Egypt as being like the quintessential Jewish event. And it's kind of the perfect illustration of what my teachers at Hebrew Union College say is the whole point of the Hebrew Bible. The whole point of the Hebrew Bible is to say that we believe in a God who's interested in and active in history. Look at, after all, how the Jewish people... Did my video freeze? Okay, the video seems to have frozen, so we've restarted it. The point of the whole Hebrew Bible, according to our Bible professors at rabbinical school, is to show that God is interested in and active in history. Look at the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's the story of a nation and another nation, the Egyptians and the Israelites, where there's a power dynamic between them, the Egyptians enslaving the Israelites, and God intervenes in the lives of these two nations, a God that's active in history. And the whole miracle of the parting of the Sea of Reeds is probably like the quintessential illustration of God's intervening in the course of history. God's interest in, first, the suffering of the Israelites, interest in, and then intervening in the course of history in the parting of the Red Sea, the saving of the Israelites from Egypt. So this psalm gives like a nice, succinct, and sort of like bullet-pointed summary of the Jewish belief or the biblical belief in divine providence. But we need not look there. We can look to sort of more commonplace Jewish texts to help us see that point. Let's move on to the next text that we're going to unpack together. It's text number 5 in our readers. And again, we're in right now the purposes curriculum. So If you haven't already opened your curriculum book, then look for lesson number 20, text number 5. I'll do what we would be doing if we were together in a classroom, which is to give you a page number here in this white reader. We're looking for page 227 in the white reader, page 227. You'll find there lesson 20, text 5. I'll pull it up on my packet as well. So the next text we're going to examine comes from the Babylonian Talmud. Remember, this is a compilation of law and lore written in Babylon, what is present-day Iraq, what was, at its time of writing, one of the centers, if not the most prominent center of Jewish life in the late ancient, early medieval period. Babylonian Talmud gets finished being composed and redacted sometime between the year 500 CE and 800 CE, so somewhere in that window, 500 to 800 CE in Babylon, what is present-day Iraq. And the following little passage is from a tractate called Makot, page 10b, and I'll read for us there. There were 2 people that killed. One of those people killed unintentionally, and the other killed intentionally. So one of them was one killed, the other one murdered, is how we would say it. There were no witnesses to either case, but the Holy One, blessed be God, caused both of them to come together in the same tavern. The one that killed unintentionally sat underneath a ladder, the one that killed intentionally, the one that murdered. The one that killed intentionally sat under a ladder, and the one that killed unintentionally descended the ladder, fell upon the former, meaning the one who killed intentionally, the one who murdered, and killed him. So the one who just killed unintentionally falls off this ladder and falls on the one who murdered, and the murderer now is killed, dies. Thus, the one who had killed intentionally was killed, and the one who had killed unintentionally ends up being exiled to a city of refuge. Remember that in the biblical framework, the Israelites are instructed that when they enter the land of Israel, they're to establish 5 cities in the land that are called cities of refuge, places to which people who commit inadvertent manslaughter are able to flee, to avoid being served extra-legal retribution by the families of those who were killed. So the one who killed unintentionally, who then later fell on the one who killed intentionally, the unintentional killer flees to a city of refuge, according to the story. Okay, I probably just made this very little paragraph more complicated than it needed to be by way of how I presented it over. If you need some time to pause the video and go back and reread it, it's actually a lot clearer on the page than it was the way I just described it to you. And so feel free to pause it if you need to. But otherwise, the thing to lift up from this text is the following. This is an articulation of a principle that we see in lots of different places in Jewish tradition that gets the following Hebrew name, midah keneged midah. And you can sort of hear that word midah gets repeated twice, midah keneged midah. It translates to mean measure for measure, midah keneged midah, meaning that a person is punished or rewarded, midah keneged midah. A person is punished or rewarded measure for measure. If you kill unintentionally, then there's one kind of consequence of that. If you kill intentionally, there's a different kind of consequence for that. Midah keneged midah, measure for measure. In our little story here, the one who killed intentionally, the murderer, he was later himself killed. The crime and the punishment fit one another. Midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Of course, we don't need this little Talmudic passage to illustrate that that's a commonplace idea in Jewish thought. Our Hebrew Bible is full of characters who have midah keneged midah kinds of consequences in their life, and I've listed just a couple of them, but there really are many, many, many more than are worth naming. I've listed a couple here on our little handout. Adam and Eve, for example, they together eat the fruit that they're not supposed to eat. They're in the Garden of Eden, and as a result of that, they're both punished. Adam with the punishment of that bread shall come forth from the earth only by the sweat of his brow. And Eve is punished with the pain of childbirth. We'll remember that from a few of our lessons in the past already, those two punishments coming from early chapters in the book of Genesis. But it's not just Adam and Eve who are punished sort of measure for measure. Moses is also punished in a measure for measure sort of way. Moses, recall, in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, hits a rock when God had instructed him to speak to the rock. And on account of hitting this rock as opposed to speaking to it, in order to hopefully draw forth water for the people to drink, on account of hitting it instead of speaking to it, God punishes Moses that Moses shouldn't, or will not rather, get to enter the promised land of Israel. And Miriam, too, also gets punished in a measure for measure sort of way. She speaks badly about her brother behind his back, or rather about his brother's wife behind both of their backs. And as a result of it, God gives her some sort of like scaly affliction. Her skin becomes leprous, is one way of understanding it. And although all four of those illustrations aren't as clear as this one, this one from our Babylonian Talmud passage, this person who murdered does himself get killed, that's like a 1-for-1 midah keneged midah. Nevertheless, we can see that the Torah tradition knows of a system of reward and punishment, that our consequences have our actions have consequences, and that it even, we're able to see in the Torah narratives the dotted line between the action and its consequence. It's not paid out in some future date. It's not a mysterious payout. It's like immediate, it's explained, it's clear. So even though there's not the one-to-one correlation the way there is in this text where the murderer is himself then killed, we nevertheless see in the biblical illustrations that I just gave that there's, at the very least, this idea that our actions do have consequences, and that we can see the link between the actions and the consequences. Okay, so this further fills out the picture of the classical Jewish belief in divine providence, that God is interested in what happens here on earth, and that God sometimes intervenes in what happens here on earth, in that when people misbehave, God notices, and God also remits punishment. Remits, is that the word I want? We're going to go with it. Remits punishment for the bad behavior. Okay, so we have so far set up the idea of divine providence, and it's a nice idea, right? It's a nice idea. It's a problematic idea in a lot of ways. It doesn't take a ton of imagination to see why it's a problematic idea. All you have to do is look around us at the world, the newspaper, and see that there's not a ton of lived evidence to make the case that God is interested in, much less intervening in, the world of human affairs. People suffer, and sometimes there seems to be no good reason for why it is that people suffer. And perhaps the best statement of that problem, which again, remember I said at the very top, has a fancy philosophical name. The fancy philosophical name is theodicy. Theodicy means the problem of suffering in a theological system. The most famous statement of theodicy, of why or when bad things happen to good people, is from the biblical book of Job. So in the Melton Reader, a selection from the book of Job is listed as text number 7. And again, if you're following along in your own Hebrew Bible at home, then you can turn now to the book of Job, chapter 21. If you're following along on the handouts that I've shared as a PDF, then you'll just look on to the next page where I've listed this selection from the book of Job. We're not going to unpack this so much. Mostly I just want to have us be familiar with it, to get a feel for how it is that Job, or rather I should say the writer of the book of Job, articulates the problem of theodicy, the problem of suffering, the problem of when bad things happen to good people. Okay, so here it is in the mouth of Job, or maybe better, by the pen of the writer of the book of Job. So Job chapter 21, verse 7. Why do the wicked live on, asks Job, prosper and grow wealthy? Their children are with them always, and they see their children's children. Their homes are secure without fear. They do not feel the rod of God. Their bull breeds and does not fail. Their cow calves and never miscarries. They let their infants run loose like sheep, and their children skip about. They sing to the music of timbrel and lute, and revel to the tune of the pipe. They spend their days in happiness and go down to Sheol in peace. Sheol is the netherworld in biblical thought, sort of like Hades in Greek thought. The wicked spend their days in happiness and go down to Sheol in peace. They say to God, it's, by the way, important, I should pause and explain. It's not a place of punishment, Sheol. Sheol is just the inevitable place where all people wind up. The book of Genesis talks about the fact that Jacob will go down to Sheol. Even the most righteous, every single soul in the biblical worldview goes down to Sheol, regardless of merit or lack thereof. So where it says here, and go down to Sheol in peace, we shouldn't think of like hell. It's not a hell. It's just like the world of the dead. Okay, so having said that, let's reread 13 again. They, referring from verse 7 to the wicked. The wicked spend their days in happiness, and they go down to Sheol in peace, to the world of the dead in peace. The wicked say to God, leave us alone. We don't want to learn your ways. What is Shaddai? That's a name for God. What is Shaddai that we should serve God? What will we gain by praying to God? Their happiness is not their own doing. The thoughts of the wicked are beyond me. And again, I share this text not because there's anything so special to lift out of it, but more because it's probably the best Jewish articulation of the problem of suffering. We can probably, hopefully we don't have any personal experience with this, but we can use even just a little imagination to come up with people who don't do a lot of great in this world, maybe even do some harm in this world, if not a lot of harm in this world. And like Job, or the author of the book of Job, is saying, nevertheless, prosper and grow wealthy, have abundant family around them. Their children are with them always. They see their children's children. Their homes are secure. They don't feel the rod of God, which is a funny rhyming phrase in English, but is a great biblical way of saying they never get punished for anything that they do. That's a problem for a people who asserts that God is interested in what happens here and can intervene in what happens here. Why should those things happen? So that's the problem, as articulated by Job, or the author of the book of Job. And we're going to now hear a couple of, I can't say solutions. These aren't solutions to the problem. We're going to hear a couple of approaches to addressing this problem. They're more responses than solutions. So let's take a look at them together now. By the way, you'll notice that I've done things a little bit out of order, at least out of order according to the Melton curriculum. We just read text 7 from the book of Job. We're now going to go backwards, at least in the Melton curriculum, to text 6 on account of the fact that I thought logically it made more sense to do Job before the next one. So we're looking now at text 6, which is listed as Numbers chapter 14. So if you're following along in your own Hebrew Bible, please turn to the book of Numbers. And for those who are following along on our handouts, you'll see I've included the text here for us. So here we are in the book of Numbers. This is our first of a few responses to the problem of theodicy, the problem of suffering, the problem of when bad things happen to good people. Let's take a look at it together now. So we're here in the book of Numbers, and the moment in the story, the context for when this passage appears in the Torah is the following. The Israelites who are wandering from Egypt toward the land of Israel have made it basically to the southern border of the land of Israel, and they decide that they need to send in 12 scouts to sort of scout out the land, see if it's inhabitable, get a feel for what it is that they're going to be up against when they prepare to enter the land, to conquer the land. So they send in these 12 scouts, and the scouts come back with a report. And 10 of the 12 scouts say, do not go in there. It's a land that is inhabited by giants. It's a land that swallows up its inhabitants. If we were to try and fight with the people who live there in order to take their place, then we would surely get eaten up. We should not go through with this. That's what 10 of the 12 scouts say. 2 of the scouts have a different takeaway from their scouting mission. 2 of the scouts say, you know what? You're right. There are giants there, but you know what? We can do this thing. Like, after all, we've got God on our side. What's more, this is a God who intervened for us against the Egyptians. It's a God who parted the Sea of Reeds, a God who provided for us in the wilderness with manna and with a miraculous well of water that followed us through the desert. If God can do all of that stuff and has already proven God's care for us and God's intervening on our behalf for us in the past, then how much the more so should we feel confident that God would do so again? These 2 scouts say, yeah, it's a big challenge. The 10 scouts are right, but we can do it. Unfortunately, the Israelites who hear this scouting report side with the 10 and not the 2. They say, oh gosh, as they say many times in the Torah, oh gosh, Moses, you led us out of Egypt. We would have been better off being slaves in Egypt than to be brought out here to this wilderness to die, than to be brought here to the edge of this promised land only to try and conquer it and get devoured by the giants who live there. The Israelites really are upset when they hear the scouting report and follow the advice of the 10 with the negative report. And God sees how the Israelites react and is disappointed. Disappointment would be an understatement, actually. God is angry. God is angry. God feels as the 2 scouts did, which is, wait a minute, look at all I've done for you so far. How could you possibly stop believing in me now? You Israelites have been so difficult from the beginning, all along the way, and up until now. I'm done with you, God says. And God threatens to destroy the Israelites for lack of faith in God. And when Moses hears that God's planning to destroy the Israelites for their lack of faith, Moses has a talk with God. And Moses says the following, what we're about to read. Moses says the following to God. Moses reminds God, actually, of something that God has said before about God's self to Moses. Moses says the following to God when God is threatening to destroy the entire Israelite people. Here we are over here in Numbers 14. Moses says, the eternal, meaning God, slow to anger and abounding in kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not remitting all punishment, but visiting the iniquity of fathers upon children, upon the 3rd and 4th generations. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to your great kindness, as you have forgiven this people ever since Egypt. And God said, in response to Moses, I pardon as you have asked. Okay, so we have here Moses making a plea to God to not act out of anger against the Israelites, but rather to act out of compassion against the Israelites, or compassion for the Israelites, I should say. Moses reminds God that God is a God of mercy, that God is, as it says here in verse 18, slow to anger and abounding in kindness, forgiving of iniquity and transgression. Moses reminds God of God's better nature, that God has a better nature, and says, act from, and this is what I've written here in our little handout, act from your understanding, your kindness, your compassionate side, God, rather than from the side of you that insists on compliance with the rules, or the side of you that insists that humans assume responsibility for their actions. And God listens. As it says in verse 20, God says, I pardon as you have asked. So it's an illustration of the idea that a world that's run midah keneged midah, a world that's run where every action has a consequence and the line can be drawn between actions and consequences, well, that kind of world would certainly be more fair. Well, that kind of world would certainly be less maddening in the way of Job, while that kind of world would be easier to understand. Why or how things work would be easier to understand, like why we should bother to try and be good, that kind of world would also be untenable to live in. Think about it for a minute. A world in which God acts always out of justice, a world in which God always punishes transgression, is a world that is untenable to live in. I think there's a movie called Minority Report. I haven't seen it, so don't quote me. But I think the idea is that regardless of whether it's in that movie or not, there's if we lived in a world where like every action was punishable immediately, then none of us would ever survive. Because who among us hasn't slipped up? Who hasn't accidentally been driving 5 miles an hour over the speed limit? If you drove 5 miles an hour over the speed limit and were fined every single time that you did that, then we'd all be in debt to the DMV and to whoever else those fines go to. I guess the Scarsdale City Courthouse or something like that. It's a kind of world that really is unforgiving and isn't a place that any of us could live in. We need God to act not out of strict justice, but sometimes with compassion, even though that means that sometimes people who act badly won't be punished. It's sort of a necessary consequence of people's not being punished for their actions is sort of a necessary consequence of the world being inhabitable, This would be a great time to pause and to have conversation. Unfortunately, we're not sitting all together. So this would actually be a really good time. I would encourage you, if you want to pause this video, to write down any thoughts, to email them to us, to me. I'd be really eager to hear what you're thinking about, what questions or challenges you might have for what we're talking about right now. So feel free to do that. And if you're not doing that, if you want to just continue on with the talk as I'm giving it, then that's okay too. I just want to share two more little pieces that I've bullet pointed here on our outline. The first is that there's this midrash that says that at first God tried to create a world in which strict justice was the rule, that every action had a clearly articulated consequence, that you could draw the line from action to consequence. And God quickly saw that that kind of world is unsustainable. And in fact, God had to start over and do it again. And this time build a world with some sort of mixture of justice and compassion. Even though a world that has a mixture of justice and compassion winds up being one which is sometimes morally dissatisfying. So that's a midrash on this problem. The book of Jonah, by the way, is all about this. Remember, Jonah complains at the end of the book. We read this on Yom Kippur afternoon. Jonah complains at the end of the book saying, God, how could you have forgiven all those Ninevites? They deserved to be punished. Like, they've been lawless for years and years, and suddenly you're just going to say they're forgiven? That's unacceptable to me. And the lesson that Jonah has to learn is that a world of strict justice is one that's untenable. That forgiveness is kind of part of what makes the world go round. And just the last point on this is that if the book of Numbers is making the case this way, and if the book of Jonah is making the case in its way, then the ancient rabbis take it even further. In fact, when the ancient rabbis will retell this story from the book of Numbers, and also when they retell sort of a parallel story, the story of the golden calf. Okay, sorry, my computer just went to sleep. I think we're still here though. Okay. When the rabbis will retell this story from the book of Numbers, and when they retell the story of the golden calf, they take it even further. They have the statement that Moses makes to God cut off sort of midway through it. It doesn't say the eternal, slow to anger and abounding in kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not remitting all punishment. It stops halfway through. The rabbis, when they retell the story, all that it says is the eternal, slow to anger and abounding in kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, period. Full stop. The rabbis demand that God be a forgiving God because they recognize, perhaps strongest of all, that a world of strict justice is a world that's untenable to live in. That's an idea that's called grace, and we could talk more about it when we're together some other time. Okay, so just to make sure that we understand how what everything we just said around text 6 here fits into our conversation today about divine providence, it's the following. We're making the case that God is interested in what happens on earth and can intervene in what happens on earth. But then we have a problem, which is then why do people suffer needlessly sometimes? Why do bad things happen to good people? And one response from the book of Numbers and from this Midrash, which I've mentioned, and from Jonah, which I mentioned, and also from the rabbis, is the following, is that a world where God always intervened on behalf of the righteous and against the wicked would be an untenable world, because all of us are mixed bags. And if God were always to intervene, then only like the 0.0001% of people who like have the moral integrity to make it through that kind of world would survive. It'd be an impossible place to live. Okay. That's one response to the problem of theodicy. Let's look at two others. We're going to spend probably a little less time on these other two. The next one we're going to look at is listed as text 8 in the Melton curriculum. So if you're looking again here in your white purposes reader, you're looking for lesson 20, text number 8, and it can be found on page 228. Let me turn there in my packet as well. So this is a selection from Rambam. That's Maimonides. Maimonides, the great medieval Spanish Jewish thinker, considered to be like maybe the greatest Jewish mind of all time. And he wrote all kinds of really important Jewish works. And the one we're reading from right now is called The Guide for the Perplexed. This is his seminal philosophical treatise. He also has a halachic treatise, a book on Jewish legal standards. But this is not his book on Jewish legal standards. This is his book on philosophy, The Guide for the Perplexed. And this selection comes from Guide for the Perplexed, Book 3, Chapter 17, Section 18, if you want to look it up later. So let's read there together. Rambam, Guide for the Perplexed. In the lower or sublunary portion of the universe, divine providence does not extend to the individual members of species, except in the case of humankind. Meaning, divine providence only applies to humans. God is not interested in or intervening in the affairs of dogs. God is not interested in or intervening in the affairs of trees or of rocks, much the less so. Only to the case of mankind. Continuing on. It is only in this species that the incidents in the existence of the individual beings, their good and evil fortunes, are the result of justice, in accordance with the words, "For all God's ways are judgment." That's a quote from the book of Psalms, I think. But, says Maimonides, I agree with Aristotle as regards all other living beings, and a fortiori as regards plants and all the rest of earthly creatures. For I do not believe that it is through the interference of divine providence that a certain leaf drops from a tree, nor do I hold it that when a certain spider catches a certain fly, that this is the direct result of a special decree and will of God in that moment. It is not by a particular divine decree that the spittle of a certain person moved, fell on a certain gnat in a certain place and killed it, nor is it by the direct will of God that a certain fish catches and swallows a certain worm on the surface of the water. In all these cases, the action is, according to my opinion, entirely due to chance, as taught by Aristotle. Let's pause there for a second. I think the point is clear, and I've listed it here as a bullet point in our handout. So this is now on the third page of the handout, by the way, that only humans merit divine providence on account of we're going to get to the on account of in a second. Only humans merit divine providence, not animals, not plants or inorganic life. Let's continue reading. Divine providence is connected with divine intellectual influence, and the same beings which are benefited by the latter, the same beings which are benefited by divine intellectual influence, so as to become intellectual, and to comprehend things comprehensible to rational beings, are also under the control of divine providence, which examines all their deeds in order to reward or punish them. Okay, that was a complicated way of saying only beings which manifest intellect, which Rambam believes is the primary category or thing that God is. God is pure intellect, according to Rambam. So only those beings that have intellect, namely humans, are under the realm of divine providence, because intellect goes with intellect. God's divine intellect matches up in certain ways with human intellect. And one of those ways that they match up is that humans are subject to divine providence, unlike plants and animals, which are subject only to random chance. Let's continue reading. Under the control of divine providence, which examines all their deeds, God examines all our deeds in order to reward or to punish them, meaning us. It may be by mere chance that a ship goes down with all her contents, as in the above mentioned instance, or the roof of a house falls upon those within. Those things are just chance. A ship going down or the roof of a house falling on people, those are chance, like what happens to dogs and what happens to trees. Ships sinking, roofs caving in, all a matter of chance. But it is not due to chance, writes Rambam, according to our view, that in one instance there were men that went into the ship or who remained in the house in the other instance. Meaning, it may be according to chance that, the tree is struck by lightning and falls down on the house. It's not according to chance, however, that there were people inside the house. Because, again, people have intellect and God has intellect. And as goes one intellect, so goes the other. God is keeping human beings under divine providence, and what happens to human beings is not by chance, even though the things that happened around them are by chance. Again, according to Rambam. Final thought here from the Rambam. It is due to the will of God and is in accordance with the justice of God's judgments, the method of which our mind is incapable of understanding. Okay, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, at least to me, is that Rambam has taken all this time to make this case that it's only intellectual beings, namely humans, that are under the influence of divine providence, and yet he still admits that whatever the reasons are that God chooses for some people to be inside a house while the roof collapses and other people to be outside the house while the roof collapses, that the reasons for those things are beyond the ability of the human mind to understand. So there is some kind of degree of difference between human intellect and divine intellect. The reasoning for God's decisions are beyond our ability to comprehend. And nevertheless, because we have some degree of comprehension, we are still subject to divine providence. Problematic, to say the least. But then again, as I said at the very beginning of all of this, the problem of evil is the thorniest and the least solvable dilemma in the theological book of questions. So we shouldn't find it entirely surprising that even Rambam, the likely greatest Jewish thinker of all time, has inconsistencies or problems with his theology when it comes to theodicy, when it comes to the problem of suffering. So again, just looking back at our handouts for 1 second, you'll see my second bullet point here is that what we've just talked about, that some people suffer and some people prosper, and why, according to Rambam, is the following, is due to the will of God, and it's in accordance with the justice of God's judgments, the method of which our mind is incapable of understanding. We just talked about all of that. There's a little bit of an inconsistency there, or a problem there. And I just am reminded in reading Rambam's piece here that he's not the first to say something like that. In fact, if you read the whole book of Job, it's a long book, good luck. If you read the whole book of Job, you'll see that kind of the resolution of things is after Job persists long enough in making his case to God, saying, God, I don't understand why the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. I don't understand why this bad thing, or rather this calamity of bad things, has befallen me. After Job continually makes his case to God and pounds on the door and brings the best arguments forward, God basically says, enough, silence. You think you're so smart, you human? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I set this whole system up? You think you know something? You don't have the faintest idea how I, God, work. Which is a poetic, in a certain way, a strong rebuke of the notion that human beings could ever be inside of the decision-making process of God. It's sort of a biblical way of saying, if there is a reason, humans will never understand it. If there is a reason why the wicked sometimes prosper and the righteous sometimes suffer, then humans will never understand it. I would add quickly, by the way, that in the biblical mind, there is a reason, but that reason is beyond comprehension to us. And for Rambam too, there is a reason, but that reason is beyond comprehension. I think in sort of our context, we could add the clause, if there is a reason, then that reason is beyond our understanding. So just wanted to put Rambam's idea into the context of Job's. Let's read just the last little section here from Rambam and see how he concludes his little section here. So back to our readers. This is the second paragraph of text 8. Rambam writes, "The relation of divine providence is not the same to all people. The greater the human perfection a person has attained, the greater the benefit he derives from divine providence. This belief that God provides for every individual human being in accordance with his merits is one of the fundamental principles on which the law is founded." So in short, what I've given here as a bullet point is the greater the character development of the person, the greater the benefit, the more willing God is going to be to intervene on our behalf through divine providence. Now, the corollary to that is that the lesser degree of character development, the more subject we are to the chaos of the world, the more likely we are that that tree, which is subject to chance, will fall on our house and potentially harm us. This is problematic also, to say the least, because we know, and I'm sure Rambam knew too, that even people who have great character development nevertheless suffer. So I don't see this argument as being logically holding water. And I wonder what you think about it. And again, this would be a great opportunity to pause your video, to write down some notes. I would love to receive any email thoughts about these things. Would love to be in conversation about it. Okay, let's look at our final text in this lesson. We're going to look in the readers, the white readers, the purpose is readers, at text number 9. It's on page 230. This is a selection, again, from the Babylonian Talmud, from a tractate called Ta'anit, page 20b. And let's read it together now. Okay, so it's a story about two rabbis. And one of them is called Rav Huna, and the other one is called Rav Ada ben Ahava. So get them in your minds, draw a little face for them in your minds so that you can follow which rabbi does which thing in the story. Here goes. So Rav Huna had wine stored in a certain dilapidated house, and he wished to remove it. He took Rav Ada ben Ahava into that house and kept him occupied with traditional teaching until he had removed the wine. Let me just pause here and say a word. Rav Ada ben Ahava is known in sort of like the world of the lore of the ancient rabbis to be like a particularly righteous person, someone who, remember I mentioned earlier people who are like in the 0.001% of like moral integrity. Rav Ada ben Ahava would be like in that category. So just to sort of get us on the same page, Rav Huna has got this wine. It's in a house which is like dilapidated and likely to maybe cave in eventually. Rav Huna wants to get his wine out of the house, and in order to do so, he takes this really, really righteous guy, Rav Ada ben Ahava, puts him in the house, has him like teach and study inside the house while he goes down into the basement and removes the wine, on the assumption that God would never let this super, super righteous Rav Ada ben Ahava die in a dilapidated house. This guy wouldn't deserve it. Okay, that's where we are so far. Going back to the Talmudic text. As soon as they left the house, it caved in. Rav Ada ben Ahava noticed this and was offended. So we might think, by the way, that he shouldn't be offended. If anything, maybe he should be like, oh, computer went to sleep again. Okay, we're still here. If anything, we think he might not be offended, but pleased, like, oh, look, someone recognized me as being among the 0.0001% of righteous people in this world. I'm happy to have my righteousness put into service of anyone who needs me and needs sort of protecting from harm. But that's not how he reacts. In fact, he's offended. And again, reading from the text. The rabbi noticed this and was offended because he agreed with a certain statement from another colleague of theirs named Rabbi Yanai, who said, "A person should never stand in a place of mortal danger and declare a miracle will befall me. Perhaps a miracle will not befall him. And if a miracle does befall him, that person thereby suffers a reduction from his merits." Okay, so what is there to say about this text? Two things that I want to lift up. One is this idea about maybe a miracle won't befall him. It's a way of the rabbis acknowledging that this idea that the righteous will be looked after doesn't always happen. Sometimes a righteous person might be brought inside of a house and the house still may cave in on them. Miracles don't always befall us. And this seems to be the rabbis acknowledging that without saying so sort of like directly, they kind of do it obliquely, like through the form of a story and through the form of like a maxim or a principle. They say sort of obliquely that bad things do happen to good people. And we can't always rely on God intervening in our lives against the forces of chance. That's the first thing to lift up from this. And then the second thing, which is really interesting, is the last sentence, which is that if a miracle does befall him, he thereby suffers a reduction from his merits. The idea here being that we shouldn't seek to rely only on miraculous intervention. And in fact, when we do seek to rely only on miraculous intervention, it reduces our merit. The way that I've said it here is probably clearer on the handout, which is the following, that it's improper to manipulate divine providence in this way. We shouldn't like bring righteous people around us, those like 0.0001%, only in order so that our car won't be the one to get in the accident on the highway. That's a misuse or an abuse of the providential system. And we can easily see why that would be the case. The sort of like takeaway from all of that from the rabbis is one that's like, unfortunately, very fitting for the times that we're living in right now, which is that we need to always take all the necessary precautions to help keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. We can't rely on miracles to intervene on our behalf. We may or may not believe that God is interested in the first place and going to intervene in the second place. And even if we do believe those things, we nevertheless, because the rabbis definitely did believe both those things, we nevertheless need to take all the necessary human precautions we can to keep ourselves safe and never to put ourselves unnecessarily in harm's way. So this has been our discussion. I hope it will become a discussion by your sending me your thoughts and ideas and concerns and questions about the classical Jewish notion of divine providence. And we'll look forward to continuing these conversations, hopefully in an interactive platform via Zoom next week. And I hope you'll also watch on to the second video, which will be on the rhythms curriculum on the theme of marriage. But with that, everybody stay safe out there and look forward to being in touch soon. Bye-bye.